No.
Yeah.
There's no lack of subject, is there? Amazing, isn't it? I want to talk just a little bit more about forgiveness from my point of view, and then I want some feedback from you about what came up in your group. As one author says, for forgiveness to be needed, some kind of injury must have taken place, and the result of all injury is some kind of hurt. And I think the hurt forms itself around two relational ideas. One's lack of loyalty, some kind of disloyalty, and the other is some kind of betrayal. One follows after the other, if you will. Those are both relational ideas, and forgiveness is a relational concept. We are relational creatures. The one thing that God said in the garden in the first 2 chapters is that it's not good for mankind, man or woman, to be alone. We are designed to be in relationship. That's why we have lots of talk in the church about community and having community in some meaningful way, and who defines community, and on you go. If you're like us, we moved to Colorado about 10 years ago and 9 years ago, and we're still struggling to find, if you will, community, or create community, or make community. It probably says more about us than the community we're in. Nevertheless, it's a difficult task, especially in a mobile culture. And the closer we live in proximity, the more difficult relationships become. And so the more needed these resources are, and the more applied. Anyway, so much for that. If you're hurt, the next thing is there's some kind of hate comes up. It's a reason for anger or hate. It's the usual result of that. And it demands that we're at least self-aware enough to place our emotions in check enough to say, yeah, this is what I'm feeling, this is what's going on in me, this is the revenge I feel, this is where I'm stuck. If you can identify, that helps. The third part is healing takes place after that recognition, not before. You can't be hurt and then just be healed. You got to deal with the product of the hurt. The problem is a lot of people don't get to this place, so since we live unhealed, we carry around tremendous freedom killers, okay? And then the last thing is reconciliation happens only if what? Only if the reconciled person is repentant. You can't reconcile with a non-repentant person. You know what repentance means? Repentance means that a person actually changes something. And it's a twofold behavior. It's not just one. We learn best when there's just one thing to learn. When I haven't got any knowledge of something and then I learn it. But repentance is the act of unlearning something and learning something new to replace it. So it's a two-step act. And you can't, I don't believe, reconcile with somebody who is not repentant. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. You can be loving toward them and you can forgive them, but that's a different act. Okay? I want to tell you one other thing before we start having our conversation. This is what I think forgiveness is not. See it? Sorry about that. Forgiveness is not forgetting. They don't go together. Number one, you can't forget. It's pretty frightening to me as I read in the newspaper this week about the new pill that they're coming up with that will erase some traumatic memories. What does that do? Our memories are goofy enough. I mean, I think we trust them way, way too much. They don't tell us the truth most of the time. We're finding that out. We know that memory is productive. It's not reproductive. You don't reproduce something in your mind like you would in a file system where you go pull out the piece of paper and it's the same identical piece of paper that you put in there. You don't do that in your mind. Every time you remember something, you change it a little bit. You add to it, take away from it. It merges with some other stuff. So be careful with this whole idea of memory. The other thing is, don't kid yourself. Forgiveness is not going to help you forget. If you've been traumatized in some way, you're going to remember it. Hello? What the scriptures give you is a basis on which you can face the reality of it, no matter how horrible it is. The second one is it's not releasing the anger or the hate. It's being able to acknowledge the fact that you are angry. Both this one and the third one get fouled up when I talk to people quite often, is I think people want to get rid of the anger and then they feel okay. The fact of the matter is, in God's economy, when something is violated, an appropriate response is to the violation. It's to say, this wasn't okay. So what's our move inside is that we want some kind of justice. We want it to be fair. When I think of fair, I always think of the same illustration. When we were in California back in the 70s, there was a fella who kidnapped a whole kindergarten class on a bus. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this. He buried the bus for ransom and eventually killed all those kids. Now stop the story, spin ahead and ask you, what kind of restitution is possible? What kind of justice is possible in that setting? It's mind-boggling, isn't it? What could you do that would be enough? So, releasing the anger, or I don't think forgiveness is losing the desire for revenge. I think revenge can be a very holy thing if you think about it. If you hate evil and sin in the same way that God hates evil and sin, then you want vengeance to be carried out. And all you have to do is read the imprecatory Psalms in the Bible, and you will find a number of them, at least 20 of them, where the psalmist is yelling at God for revenge, vengeance, and justice. Why? Because there's a holiness piece to that somehow. Don't be too quick to say, if I get rid of this, I'll be fine. The last one is probably the one that most of us go for, which is peace at any cost. You know, whatever it takes to feel at peace, just so I'm happy. Listen to this story. Some of you have already heard it. But I think it illustrates some of the strength of this. Simon Weisenthal's story, he was a prisoner in a concentration camp and told one day he was assigned to clean out rubbish from the barn the Germans had improvised into a hospital for wounded soldiers. Toward evening, a nurse took Weisenthal by the hand and led him to a young SS trooper. That trooper's face was bandaged and with pus-soaked rags and his eyes tucked behind the gauze. He was perhaps 21 years old. He grabbed Weisenthal's hand and clutched it. He said that he had to talk to a Jew. He could not die before he had confessed his sins he had committed against helpless Jews. And he had to be forgiven by a Jew before he died. So he told Weisenthal the horrible tale of how his battalion had gunned down Jews, parents and children who were trying to escape from a house set on fire by the SS troopers. Weisenthal listened to the dying man's whole story, first the story of his innocent youth, and then the story of his participation in evil. At the end, Weisenthal jerked his hand away and walked out of the barn. No word was spoken, no forgiveness was given. Weisenthal would not, could not forgive. But he was not sure he did right. So he ended his story called The Sunflower. If you've never read it, it's pretty riveting. With a question. He says, what would you have done? 32 eminent persons, mostly Jewish, contributed their answers to this hard question. Most, said Weisenthal, was right. He should not have forgiven the SS trooper. It would not have been fair. Why should a man who gave his will to the doing of monumental evil expect a quick word of forgiveness on his deathbed? What right had Weisenthal to forgive the man for the evil he had done to other Jews? If Weisenthal forgave the soldier, he would be saying that the Holocaust was not so evil. Let the SS trooper go to hell, said one respondent. And this author goes on and says, many of us feel the same way when we are unfairly hurt in far less horrible ways. Sometimes our hate is the only ace we have left in our deck. Our contempt is our only weapon. Our plan to get even is our only consolation. Why would we want to forgive? Why, indeed?